There's a certain kind of judgment that gets directed at people who avoid phone calls. They're called anxious, avoidant, socially stunted, too dependent on screens. And that judgment tends to come from people who have never stopped to question whether the phone call was actually the right tool in the first place. You probably know someone who will do almost anything to avoid making a phone call. They'll send 3 emails instead of 1 call. They'll show up in person rather than dial a number. They'll let their phone ring out, then immediately type a text that says, "Hey, what's up?" as if the call never happened. Maybe you are that person. And here's what's interesting. Most people assume this is shyness or laziness or some mild social dysfunction that probably needs fixing. But if you recognize yourself here, it doesn't mean you're antisocial or bad at communication. It usually means your brain prefers to think before it speaks. And phone calls structurally don't allow for that. The more you look at the psychology beneath this behavior, the more you realize it's a lot more coherent than it first appears. It's not random. It's not a flaw. It's a very specific response to a very specific kind of demand that phone calls place on the human brain. Start with what a phone call actually asks of you. When your phone rings, you're being asked to enter a real-time conversation with no preparation time, no ability to see the other person's face, no way to gauge their mood before you respond, and no pause button when you need to collect your thoughts. You have to process what you're hearing, formulate a response, manage your own emotional tone, and keep up with the rhythm of someone else's expectations, all at the same time, starting from the moment you pick up. Researchers who study how the brain handles mental tasks have a name for this kind of demand: cognitive load. It's the amount of working memory your brain has to dedicate to a task in real time. And phone calls for certain kinds of minds generate an unusually high one, not because those minds are slower, often because they're more thorough, because they're wired to think before they speak rather than speak while they think. The phone doesn't accommodate that. The phone punishes hesitation. There are real differences in how different nervous systems respond to open-ended, high-demand social situations. People with a more reflective thinking style tend to produce better answers when given time to consider, and noticeably worse ones when put on the spot. They're not less capable. They're more dependent on conditions that let them do their best thinking. Phone calls don't offer those conditions. Texts do. Emails do. Even a well-composed voice note does, so the avoidance isn't irrational. It's a form of unconscious quality control. But there's something else going on beneath that, something that sits a little deeper. Think about what happens in the moments before you make a phone call you've been putting off. You open the contact. You stare at the number. Maybe you put the phone down and do something else for 20 minutes. You rehearse the conversation in your head, running through possible versions of it. You imagine how the other person might respond. You anticipate the awkward silences, the unexpected questions, the moments where you might not know what to say. By the time you actually dial, if you dial, you've already had the conversation a dozen times in your head, and most of those versions didn't go exactly well. And then sometimes the phone rings and you simply don't pick up, not because you don't care, but because there was no time to prepare, no mental runway, no chance to think first. So the call goes to voicemail, and then almost immediately you open your messages and type something instead. The text arrives before the voicemail notification does. Researchers have a name for the stress that arrives before the event, not during it: anticipatory anxiety. And studies consistently show that for many people, the dread of a task is significantly more distressing than the task itself. The actual call, if you make it, is often fine, unremarkable even, but the brain doesn't process that lesson cleanly because the nervous system was primed for threat, and being primed for threat is exhausting regardless of how the thing actually turns out. What makes phone calls particularly effective at generating this kind of anticipatory stress is their fundamental ambiguity. You don't know exactly how long they'll last. You don't know what mood the other person is in. You don't know if you'll be asked something you can't answer on the spot. You can't see whether the conversation is going well from any visual cues. And perhaps most importantly, you can't walk away from it gracefully the way you might end a text exchange or close an email tab. The phone call, once entered, requires a socially negotiated exit. That's its own kind of pressure. Researchers who study this describe it as discomfort with uncertainty, a trait where ambiguous or unpredictable situations generate a stress response that feels out of proportion to the actual stakes. It's not that these people are anxious about everything. Often they function extremely well in areas of life they can structure, plan, and control, but open-ended situations with unclear rules and no defined endpoint trigger something that just doesn't match the size of the situation. And phone calls, structurally, are one of the most uncertainty-dense forms of human communication we have. That's worth sitting with. There's a tendency to frame phone call avoidance as a generational thing, something that arrived with smartphones and texting, a symptom of a generation that forgot how to talk. And there's something to that story, but it's incomplete. People who struggled with unscripted, real-time conversation existed long before the text message. The medium may have shifted the numbers, but the underlying psychology was always there. What changed is that people now have better alternatives, and when you give someone with a high cognitive load response to phone calls a lower friction option that actually suits them better, they will choose it every time. That's not avoidance in any clinical sense, that's adaptation. Here's another piece of this that rarely gets discussed. Phone calls require a performance of real-time competence. When you're in one, you're being evaluated silently on your articulation, your response speed, your ability to fill silences without becoming awkward. Most social situations carry some of this. Phone calls compress it. You have no visual channel to read whether your joke landed, no time to revise a sentence that came out wrong, no ability to add context after the fact. For people who place high value on being understood accurately, this is genuinely uncomfortable, not vanity, a desire for precision. They know they have something worth saying. They just need slightly more than 2 seconds to say it well. So instead of calling, they draft. They compose. They read it back once before sending. And when the call eventually feels unavoidable, they sometimes feel a quiet relief when the other person doesn't answer, not because they don't want to connect, but because the voicemail gives them the controlled version, the one they actually prepared for. And this is where the reframe becomes important. Because the same cognitive profile that makes phone calls feel unreasonably demanding tends to produce qualities that are genuinely valuable in other settings. People who dislike phone calls often write exceptionally well. They tend to think through implications before responding. They're usually the ones who catch problems and plans that others have already gotten excited about. They ask questions others forgot to ask. They remember the details of conversations accurately because when they're not burning all their working memory on the performance anxiety of real-time interaction, they can actually listen. These aren't compensations for a deficit. They're natural expressions of a mind that runs better with a slightly longer feedback loop. There's an idea in cognitive research about the relationship between how quickly information is processed and how thoroughly it's retained. The finding is fairly consistent. Information processed more slowly, with more deliberate attention, tends to be understood more completely. Speed of response and depth of understanding are not the same thing. They can even work against each other. The mind that's fast on the phone is not always the mind you want making the careful decision. Sometimes you want the person who said, "Let me think about that and get back to you," even if they sent that message by text. This doesn't mean phone avoidance has no costs. It does. There are moments when real-time conversation is genuinely irreplaceable, when someone needs to hear a voice, not read words on a screen, when tone and timing and warmth matter more than precision. When a 3-email chain has created more confusion than a 2-minute call would have resolved. Most phone-averse people know this intellectually. Many of them can and do make calls when they recognize it's genuinely the right tool. The avoidance is contextual, not absolute, but the broader cultural assumption that phone calls represent the gold standard of human communication and that anything less is somehow emotionally avoidant or immature, that assumption deserves some examination. We built written language for a reason. We didn't invent letters because people were too shy to talk. We invented them because certain kinds of thought require certain kinds of medium. The careful argument, the complex instruction, the nuanced feeling you need to get exactly right, these have always been better suited to the considered word than the spoken one. What we're watching now, in the broad cultural shift away from phone calls and toward asynchronous communication, might not be social regression. It might be a return to something older and, for many people, more natural. People who avoid phone calls aren't avoiding connection. They're often trying to communicate more carefully. If you're someone who screens calls and then agonizes over whether that makes you a bad friend, or who spends 20 minutes composing a phone call in your head only to talk yourself out of it, it might be worth asking whether the judgment you're applying is even the right one. The question isn't whether you can do phone calls. Most people who avoid them can and do when something genuinely requires it. The more honest question is whether the discomfort you feel is evidence of a problem or evidence of self-knowledge. Evidence that you understand the conditions under which you communicate clearly and the ones under which you don't. That's not a flaw. That's a form of intelligence. The people who learn to work with their cognitive style rather than against it, who build communication habits that suit the way they actually think rather than the way they've been told they should think, those people tend to communicate more honestly over time. They send the considered message instead of the reactive one. They have fewer misunderstandings, not more. They leave clearer records of what was actually agreed to. Their absence from the phone doesn't mean they're less connected. It often means they're more deliberate about connection. And maybe that's the thing worth taking seriously here, not the avoidance itself, but the underlying awareness that communication done well requires knowing yourself. Knowing what you need to think clearly, to speak accurately, to be actually present in a conversation rather than just technically present in one. That kind of self-knowledge is rare, and it's worth understanding, not apologizing for. So now I'm curious. Are you someone who prefers text and email whenever possible, who finds something quietly relieving about a call that goes to voicemail? Or are you one of the rare people who actually likes phone calls, who picks up without a second thought? Drop it in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know which side of this you're on.